Hello, welcome to episode 7 of this series of the Tyndale House podcast. We're looking at names in the Bible and in the ancient world. And this is an extra episode for the series because we talked too long in the last episode and we decided that we'd make an extra episode of it. We're talking about throne names. So people are born with one name and then they have a different name when they're on the throne. And I'm joined again by Caleb Howard and Jane Speejohn, both involved in our Old Testament names project. So, throne names. If you're going to be king, what are you going to take as your throne name?
Well, you want an appropriate name, don't you? Mm-hmm. So, you can talk some more about this. Is it true that the guy who we call Sargon, is this Sharuken? Does that mean a just king, an authentic king, or something like that? And is that a throne name that was taken in order to sort of frame Sargon as a rightful heir?
You sprung this on me.
I have.
So, yeah. Okay, so the king that James is talking about kind of reigns toward the end of the 8th century BC. He is the king who probably sort of finished carrying out the siege of Samaria and sort of carries off the Israelites into captivity. So that's 722. And Sargon was probably a son. I think it's pretty clear that he's a son of the king Tiglath-Pileser III, who's known in the Bible as Pul. And he usurps the throne from his brother, Shalmaneser V. Shalmaneser is mentioned in the Bible as the one who besieged Samaria. And he did besiege Samaria, but he died sort of toward the end of the siege of Samaria. And Sargon takes over the throne of Assyria and also finishes out the siege of Samaria and so on. Sargon's name is generally written probably Sharu-Ukin, which means he, probably a deity, established the king. So the problem with thinking about that as a throne name is that we have a very similar name, Sharu-Kinu, which is borne by a person who's not king at all in the same period. So it doesn't need to be a specifically royal name. The king, he established the king, could be a reference not to oneself but to the currently reigning king. It's possible that it was given to him sort of when he was born. Earlier that century. So it's not entirely clear to me that this is a throne name. Often...
Does he have other names?
No.
Okay.
So Sargon, not to my knowledge.
Right.
No. It seems that was his name right from the start. So it's often regarded as a throne name because Sargon is a well-known king from the 3rd millennium BC. So from sort of 2,000 years or so before the Sargon that we're talking about even lived. And there are kind of epic texts written about this guy. He's a sort of heroic figure in Mesopotamian literature. And it's often thought that Sargon II from the 8th century BC named himself that in reference to this epic figure from the 3rd millennium because he wanted to pattern himself after him.
Right.
But the fact is that we don't have any textual evidence of that. What we do have, though, is textual evidence that his predecessor, Shalmaneser V, had a throne name. So Shalmaneser V was almost certainly a throne name. His birth name was Ululaya, which means born in the month Ululu.
Right.
So Ululu is the 6th month in the Babylonian Assyrian calendar in the year. It's sort of August, September.
Biblically Elul, isn't it, from Nehemiah?
Yep.
So we've got it in the Bible after people have been to Babylon and come back.
Yep. So it's clear that was his name before he became king because we have letters actually written by him to his father about his work. So it seems that crown princes were set to work as officials in different parts of the empire to sort of manage little parts of the Assyrian Empire on behalf of their fathers, and to sort of learn the ropes of managing an empire. And we have letters which are connected to that. I think it's 5 letters in which he's clearly called Ululaya, and then we have him also referred to in other texts as well, and it makes it clear that Shalmaneser was his second name, his throne name in that case.
So what's the point of having a throne name?
Yeah.
Is it because it's rubbish to be called King Ulalaya?
Yeah.
Because lots of other people are called Ulalaya, and you want something a bit grander. You want to communicate something, or you want to connect with the past. What kind of reasons would a king have a throne name, whereas others don't, like Sargon?
Well, James mentioned that you want an appropriate name, which is an appropriate term for this, because probably appropriate in this case means ideologically advantageous. Mm-hmm. Right? You want your sort of royal ideology to be tied into your name, or your name to be tied into your royal ideology and reflect it so that people regard you as legitimate. Mm-hmm. And often Sharu Ukin is translated as something like he has made the king legitimate, or something like that. Sharu Kinu could be taken as legitimate king. So that's how that name is often translated. And that reflects the fact that Sargon would have wanted to be regarded as a legitimate king because he was a usurper. It's not entirely certain that that's how it worked, but
it strikes me as not a great strategy. You're not a legitimate king, so you rename yourself, I am the legitimate king, and everybody's happy.
Yes, right. You just say it, it's true.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah. If you say something often enough, it becomes true. So, but Shalmaneser V is the fifth of that name.
Right, yeah.
So there are four others before him. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the list of Assyrian kings, really right from the beginning of the first millennium BC, sort of from 1000 and so on, you have Ashur-dan II and Adad-nirari II and Tukulti-Ninurta II and Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III and Shamshi-Adad V and Adad-nirari III and so on. And you can hear that how they're all the third or the second or the fourth or the fifth or whatever. And scholars have drawn attention to the fact that Assyrian kings appear to have liked to name themselves after previous kings.
Right.
They tie themselves into the royal line that way. And it's not clear that in Assyria the firstborn necessarily became king after his father died. It could be an uncle, it could be a cousin, it could be, but it had to be someone in the family. We know that from about the 18th century BC on until the end of the Assyrian Empire in 609, it was the same family that had their kings on the throne of Assyria throughout its history. It's a remarkable thing. Wow. It's called the dynasty of Adasi. Adasi was this king in the 18th century from whom all of these other kings descended.
That is a long
It's a remarkable thing. Yeah. So it made sense then to sort of name yourself after a predecessor. Yeah. And the names of these kings all mean something theologically significant. Mm-hmm. So Tiglath-Pileser is Tukulti-Apil-Eshara. My trust is the heir of Eshara. Eshara was the temple of the god Ashur, the national god of Assyria. We've talked about Sargon. Shalmaneser is Salmanu Asharedu or Ashared, which means the god Salmanu is foremost. We have Ashur-nirari, Ashur is my help. Ashur-natsirpal and Ashur-natsir-apli, Ashur is the protector of the air, and so on. So all of these names all had sort of theological significance. And they tied you not only with the deities and the kind of religious conception in Mesopotamia, but also with the line of kings before you, which mattered quite a lot for the Assyrians. Now, it's not always clear that throne names were taken when you took the throne. It's possible that kids were designated for the throne at birth, and that they were given appropriate royal names right from the start.
I see.
But Tiglath-Pileser III, another 8th century king, the father of Sargon II, was actually the fourth son of Adad-nirari III to become king. And Adad-nirari III's sons were Shalmaneser IV, Ashur-dan III, Ashur-nirari V, and then Tiglath-Pileser III. Tiglath-Pileser himself usurped the throne from his predecessor. Now, the fact that you have 4 sons of the same king with appropriate royal names strongly suggests to most scholars that they gave themselves those names after they became king, or in connection with becoming kingship.
Because the father, who did you say the father was?
Adad-nirari III.
Yeah, so Adad-nirari III wouldn't have given all of his sons
royal names. That would have been a problem.
Yes.
Fighting over the throne would have been inevitable in a way, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of inevitable already. Yeah. So it's clear that they did give royal names, but in other cases it seems likely that names were given right from the start.
Yeah. And some of them go nicely as birth names, don't they? So the name Caleb mentioned, Ululaya, almost certain that was given at birth. It's
born in the 6th month or something.
Very hard to imagine that someone in their 20s would suddenly acquire that as a name.
Yeah.
And so there's a nice parallel then with what we thought about last time around with Benjamin. So Ben-Oni refers to a son of sorrow, the manner of birth, and Benjamin is a bit more ideological, more of a statement, etc. Likewise, Ululaya, kind of birth event, circumstances, and then Chamonix are more of a statement, more theophoric, etc.
There's one more case is just worth mentioning because it's a bit of a different case. You might think that throne names were always used as your sort of given name if you were king, but in the case of Esarhaddon, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, it wasn't the case. He had a very long throne name, Ashur Etelilani Mukin Apli, I think it was. Ashur, the prince of the gods, is the one who establishes the heir. And there's even a case in one letter where that name is abbreviated. You can see how it becomes a kind of mouthful. So normally he didn't use that name. He used his given name, Ashur Acha Idina. Ashur has given a brother. And I think
which implies non-firstborn, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's very clear.
A brother.
Yeah. So it's very clear I think it's fairly clear. There are a number of points of evidence which suggest that Esarhaddon was not the firstborn son in addition to that. So it's just bearing in mind that we shouldn't leap to conclusions about how these names were used simply because they were throne names and so on.
Yeah, okay. This is a slight digression perhaps, but clearly a non-throne name. So Tiglath-Pileser III is often called Pul in the Bible.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think Pul or Pulu is probably his birth name.
Okay.
So again, he's one of 4 brothers who becomes king. He's the last of them. He probably wasn't designated as king by his father.
Okay.
So probably his name wasn't Tiglath-Pileser III, Tiglath-Pileser, Tukulti-Apile-Shara from the start. So his name was, Pul or Pulu in Akkadian. That means limestone. And we have other people bear that name as well. So it's very likely that he was born Pul, Pulu. He has that name in some texts outside of the Bible as well as inside the Bible.
Right.
And then he takes on the name Tukulti-Apile-Shara when he becomes king.
And we have names with similar semantics elsewhere. The name Balak, the Moabite, probably means limestone or something like that. And I would guess that they were complexion names. That would be my guess. Like a female name like Tsrua means literally leprous. I would guess that would be pale of complexion or something.
Yeah.
There's a whole...
Maybe Tiglath-Pileser was a whiter than usual person, a paler than usual person.
Or baby, particularly.
Or baby,
pale-born baby,
right.
So,
Right.
That whole sort of notion of colour names,
Right.
Laban, think of Levan, white,
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. Should we move on to talk about throne names in the Bible?
Yes.
So a couple of examples that I'm most familiar with, or the ones that immediately leap to mind. So Mattaniah becomes Zedekiah, and Eliakim, just before Zedekiah, becomes Jehoiakim. Yes, I always struggle to remember which way around Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin are. I should have this very clear in my head, but I still muddle them up. So, and they're both sons of Josiah. So Eliakim seems to be the firstborn son, probably, but we don't know that for certain. We know of 4 sons that he has, don't we?
Yes, and we know that the first son, Jehoiachaz, he is clearly not the firstborn son. So where am I now? 2 Kings 23. After Josiah dies, verse 30, the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Jehoiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's place. So he's kind of the people's choice. In verse 31, he's 23 when he begins to reign. He reigns 3 months, and then he's succeeded, verse 36, by Jehoiakim, who is 25. So he was, if not the firstborn, he was certainly older than Jehoahaz. So they have installed someone who wasn't the firstborn. And Jehoahaz is probably Jehovah has chosen. You know, Ahaz can be to take, and sometimes to take by lots. I think it's got that sense in numbers, like in modern Hebrew, Ahuz is a percentage. So you know, one part taken out of 100, and I can imagine that would have been a nice throne name. You know, so in reality, they've taken this guy and installed him, but you called him Jehovah has taken. So you're putting God's choice on the throne. You know, and there are multiple correlations here in this whole scenario with what we've spoken about with Assyrian throne names. So first, this guy Jehoahaz reigns, then he's succeeded by Jehoiakim, who was his brother. Jehoiakim is succeeded by Jehoiachin, his son. And Jehoiachin, I think, is the same root as Sharuukin.
That's right.
That sort of
That's
business.
right.
Yeah. So to do with
It's
being
firm,
established.
Right. Okay.
Just that kind of thing. And then after he is taken away to exile, Zedekiah,
Who's his uncle?
And who's a fairly rubbish king. And there's a nice sort of...
Most of them are around this time.
Yeah, they are, yeah. But there's a nice sort of irony when Jeremiah 22 talks about those kings in different ways with different names, and then it segues straight on in Jeremiah 23 to talk about, you know, a king who is genuinely righteous, Adonai Tzidkenu, you know, the Lord our righteousness. So God has the same elements, if you like, as Zedekiah, but he actually is righteous, you know, and he does righteousness. But it's just nice that there's this whole complex scenario, and its complexities reflected in, striving, who's going to have the throne, are you going to have an appropriate name, etc.
So we assume that Jehoahaz, then going back there, is a throne name, but we don't know what his birth name would have been, do we? I don't think do we have any evidence of his birth name?
Could have been Shalom, and that could...
yes, of course, which comes up in Chronicles, doesn't it?
Possibly, or possibly in Jeremiah. It gets quite confusing, but Shalom would have been a nice birth name. I think it has to do with like consolation, and so someone has died, or something bad has happened, and the birth of a new life is seen as, and that's a whole family of names. You know, a birth who brings comfort. Menachem is a nice example of that. Comforter, or Joseph's son, Manasseh. You know, God has made me forget. So it's that kind of name.
And you get Shalom and Menachem in the Israelite kingship as well.
Oh, right, yes. But yeah, so as a son born in bad circumstances, I can well imagine could easily get that sort of name, Shalom, you know.
Given the fact that Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah all have their names given to them, apparently, it's worth just observing the commonality between them. Jehoahaz, the Jeho element, is the Yahwistic theophoric element. And then for Zedekiah, Tzedek-Yahu, Yah, that's the theophoric element, the Yahwistic theophoric element, and Jehoiakim, the Yeho at the beginning. And it's interesting that they all have their names changed from something without it. So Shalom to Jehoahaz. Jehoiakim has the name Eliakim, which is my God has established, or something like that.
We should say, shouldn't we? Twice it's explicit. isn't it? So we're told that someone installs a king and changes his name, and we're then inferring that that's happened elsewhere.
Yeah.
But sorry.
Yeah, that's true. No. And then in the last case, both names have the Yahwistic theophoric element, Matan Yahu, Tzedek Yahu, but there's still a name change in relation to it. Yeah. And it seems like there's a bit of a pattern developing by which you become king, you get a new name, and that name has the Yahwistic theophoric element in it. It's a pattern of 3, but it's worth observing that really since the 9th century BC, to quite a while before this, Judahite kings have far more often...
We should probably should just say we're at the turn of the 7th into the 6th century, aren't we?
That's right.
For these kings?
Yeah, that's right. We're around 600 or so.
Yeah.
Around that time, sort of in the 9th century and on, more often than not, they have Yahwistic theophoric names.
Right.
And I almost wonder if by this time it had become a pattern of royal onomastics, of royal naming, that you would have what might have been regarded as a national deity as part of the king's name.
That relates to a question that I have had for a long time, which is why Pharaoh Necho, why does an Egyptian king, when they come under Egyptian control, why does he give Eliakim this name Jehoiakim? I think, what's an Egyptian doing giving him a Yahwistic name?
Well, Nebuchadnezzar does the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So with Mataniah to Zedekiah.
Yeah.
So that, I suppose that feels a little less surprising in that Nebuchadnezzar at least would have spoken a related language to an extent, more so than Egyptian. Or am I barking up the wrong tree?
Well,
but anyway, my surprise is that an Egyptian is giving a Yahwistic name. But what you're saying actually makes sense of that then. So Necho would see Yahweh as the Judahite national god and would therefore give that name?
Well, I'm more saying that actually probably most of the Judahites would have regarded Yahweh as the national god. So beyond Josiah, they're not, according to 2 Kings, they're not following the Lord in Judah. And it may well be that they increasingly took on the typical notion that each nation has its own deity, its own national god.
Okay. Yeah, right.
It can be a mix of both
things,
though, can't it?
And
from the point of view of Pharaoh, you're blending two things. So you're showing you're the guy in charge, you decide who's going to reign, and yet at the same time you're sort of respecting the local customs.
Exactly.
So you're not trying to enforce some new deity upon them. And so it can... Yeah.
There is no advantage to sort of going against the grain of the local customs when you set a puppet king on the throne.
Right.
It's sort of nice to maintain as much continuity as possible while still keeping the guy under your thumb.
Yes.
And that's essentially what both Necho and Nebuchadnezzar are trying to do.
Right.
It fails, but they're trying to do that.
Yeah. You want the local people to think that you're all right, really. You may be the new superpower on the block, but you've got our best interests at heart, kind of thing. Yeah.
It's worth noting, isn't it? We're getting the signal to wind up, but I've read so many accounts that say, look, Kings Chronicles are clearly errors in these two texts, and just this simple discussion, you're touching on a lot of the complexities, the political intrigue, the well-known custom of having multiple names, throw names that you take or drop or other people give, and as soon as you start looking at it in any detail, you can see there's a lot of coherence here, and to say that just errors in the text is a very shallow and kind of superficial view of a very complex and politically charged situation.
But it is confusing for the casual reader when Jeremiah starts talking about Coniah, and he's meaning Jehoiachin, isn't he? Which was yes.
Coniah.
That feels very confusing for people. So presumably Coniah or Jeconiah was his birth name, or is it just a variation?
That's my opinion, but I don't know that it's necessarily right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But probably wouldn't have confused an original reader.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we assume that people just have one name and they should stick with it.
Yeah. It's worth recognizing that Yehoiakin is the form of the name, or there's an equivalent to Yehoiakin in a set of ration texts from Babylon, which reflect Yehoiakin living in Babylon and being allotted a certain amount of food while living there. and it's not Coniah or Jeconiah, but rather Jehoiakim. And I wonder if that reflects the kind of formality of the name Jehoiakim.
Yeah,
it's interesting when Jeremiah talks about him. It feels more familiar, and he reverts to Coniah and Jeconiah.
Yeah, great. So, bear with the confusion.
Of course.
And say, recognise that actually there are big things going on in the background that may not be apparent to our modern eyes. But it's not random. It's not inconsistent. It's not contradictory. It just reflects the complexity of the political world and of the whole process of throne names and those kinds of things anyway. So yeah. And of course the same thing happens in our own day, doesn't it? So King George VI was not called George. That was not his first name. He was so we have that same confusion in our own day. That I growing up, I didn't understand why George VI had been called Bertie before he was the king. Oh, well, because he was Albert. It's not it's not just an ancient world thing. So we should,
Very good.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating discussion. Again, the whole series for me has been really interesting, probing into some of these things that I know just a little about, and I've really valued your expertise and that of George, who was in a couple of the earlier episodes as well. So thank you very much. And we will be recording another series in the near future on names in the Bible and the ancient world. So subscribe to the Tyndale House podcast, rate and review it wherever you get your podcasts from, and join us again for future episodes. Coming up, we'll have some more interviews with people who work here, who study here, and so those will be coming your way through your podcaster of choice very soon. Thanks. Bye.